Hello and welcome to this ET Now special. I'm Nayantara Rai. Today I'm in conversation with the Finance Minister within 24 hours of the government announcing a mega plan to revive the Indian banking system. Thank you, Mr. Arun Jaitley, for talking to ET Now. A mega plan to try and revive the Indian banking system, 2.1 lakh crore rupee recapitalization plan. Do you think this will once and for all solve the NPA crisis, the biggest legacy issue inherited by our government?
Well, I think this will substantially improve the situation. In the management of the economy of the country, there is no easy day. And our own experience of the last 3.5 years is, one after the other, we have been continuously taking up challenges, going in, taking various steps, reform measures, which respond to the situation. And many of them have worked well. Our whole program for giving an impetus to infrastructure creation, for encouraging FDI, for bringing transparency in economic and commercial decisions, all this has been rewarded very well. But then there are problems. And one of the key problems was what happens to the banks. And the manner in which the banking system was run during the two UPA governments, particularly during the second UPA government, leaves a lot to be desired. During the boom period and somewhat thereafter, you indiscriminately lent, as though there is going to be no tomorrow. And then the risk mitigation factors were not really factored in. I regret to say that the central bank also looked the other way. And then by just restructuring loans, you were evergreening the problem. And all this was being allowed. It's only in March 2015 that people woke up to the problem that you've lent so much, you can't really hide the problem below the carpet. The banks must come out with the truth as to what the real number of stressed assets are. And then, of course, the central bank came out somewhat with very strict provisioning norms. And the corrective action with regard to the banking system started. And that is what is the legacy of the NPA problem. Now, we have a situation where governmental spending is high, so public spending keeps the GDP going. Our liberalized FDI policy has brought in a lot of investment, that keeps the GDP going. There is some private sector investment. The last quarter has shown that it started creeping in, but it has to substantially improve. Those instincts of entrepreneurship in India's private sector have to take over. But then the private sector had used this money to create large capacities which were not being absorbed. The banks had lost their ability to lend. Now, demonetization brought in a lot of CASA deposits to the banks. Their current accounts, savings accounts are full of money. But in order to lend that money, the banks must have capital adequacy. Yeah. Now, how do you get the capital? And therefore, there are various, do you give it straight from the budget? Is there enough money in the budget? Do you get the Reserve Bank to part with some of its reserves? Or do you ask the banks to raise money from the market? Or do you resort to the recapitalization bonds, which in turn will add to the government debt, and that debt has to be serviced? Yeah. So, we've been in the last few months working on it. And finally, we came out with our response to the situation, where a large capital of 2.1 lakh crores is being given to the banks. Now, this certainly has to be accompanied by a series of banking reforms which we will finalize, which are the banks will be entitled to it. And I'm sure once the money gets inducted in to the banks, their ability to lend will substantially improve, and it's our priority that the SMEs should get the priority, because large businesses can even resort to global funding. They can go to the bond market. They have multiple sources. But at the end of the day, the SMEs have only the banking system to go to. And therefore, they are the ones who generate the jobs, and that's going to be a top priority for us.
Unfortunately, they also have to resort to the Indian banking system, which is saddled with high interest rates, but that's another debate. 1.35 lakh crore rupees in the form of recap bonds. You said there were various options on the table. Why did you choose this one in particular?
You see, we've chosen, in fact, three options. 18,000 crores as a leftover of the Indradhanush will come from the budget. 58,000 crores by bringing down government equity to 52%. Hopefully, the bank stocks will also move up. And the third option is the recap bonds. Now, who will be the issuing agency? We will decide. If it's the government, then it's one view. If it's some other instrumentality that we create, that's another view of the matter. And you immediately issue the bond and the debt comes to the government. But we have to balance it with considerations like fiscal deficit, spread it over a period. And these are all considerations which we are now going to work out.
You know, unfortunately, the way things are calculated as per the Indian system, this is going to perhaps impact the fiscal deficit. The IMF has different conventions.
You see, the IMF doesn't consider this as a part of the, they consider it below the line. In India, we do it otherwise. But that's if the government issues the bonds. If you create another instrumentality, which options always exist.
Like what?
I need not go into that speculation at the moment. But various options are open, and we'll keep all the options and consider the merits of all the options.
But you didn't want to perhaps trade short-term macros for higher growth. Yesterday at the press conference, you did say slight fiscal slippage is not a bad thing for the larger economy.
You see, I'll tell you, the markets have so far rewarded fiscal discipline. And this government's fiscal prudence has been exemplary. Never since independence has this kind of a fiscal discipline been maintained. And we've been gradually on a glide path, coming down and so on. But then we have a legacy problem. And a legacy problem which was left behind, and we have to resolve that problem. Now, how do you resolve the problem? When you resolve the problem, there are costs involved. And obviously, the system will then have to have broad shoulders to pay those costs.
Mr. Jaitley, you know, you said one of the options on the table was also, well, will RBI part with some of the money? You also said, unfortunately, this entire black hole in the economy of the NPAs was also under the watch of the RBI. It has reserves of almost 8.75 lakh crore rupees. Is it not also fair on the RBI to perhaps part with the funds and help
That's a decision the RBI has to take. There are many economists who have a view which support what you are saying. But then finally, it's a decision which the government doesn't take. It's a decision which the RBI has.
But would you ask the RBI to
Well, you see, the RBI and as a central bank and the government are always in discussions. And these are all discussions which we need not necessarily be all disclosed in public. In fact, on a lighter vein, these only become public when a decade after retirement, governors write their memoirs.
Yeah, that's when we actually see them coming out. You know, while I'm talking about the RBI, every bank chairman that I've been interviewing has said there have been two problems in increasing credit offtake. One has, of course, been the lack of capital, and the second one has been the tight provisioning norms. Now that they will be capitalized, do you think the time is right, perhaps, to ease provisioning norms?
I think the RBI is a very responsible institution. The RBI's object is to encourage the economy, it is to encourage growth. It's not to any form create any form of challenges to that to the growth process. And I'm sure the RBI is aware of its responsibility under the circumstances.
Yesterday at the press conference, it was quite clear that recapitalization is not just going to be quantitative, it's also going to be qualitative. You and the banking secretary, for example, spoke about that the funds will be decided on the size of the bank, the prudence shown in lending, the ethos of the bank.
That's what our preliminary decision is. The details of this are being worked out by the DFS.
But how will it not be discretionary in nature, Mr. Jaitley?
No, it will be based on a criteria.
Okay.
If it's based on a criteria, then every decision is discretionary. But if a discretion is not arbitrary, but based on certain guidelines, then it's not an arbitrary discretion.
it is very difficult to criticize the bank recapitalization. I'll make this my final point. The critics that want to criticize have said that perhaps there will be too much government paper out there in the markets. You also have a very aggressive disinvestment pipeline. The recap bonds is almost 49% of the market capitalization of PSU banks. How do you react to that? Are you putting too much government paper out there?
Well, I think there is this whole debate which goes on is the private sector going to be crowded out of the market itself. But I think the Indian market is deepening. And the fact that the bond market is deepening over the last 2 to 3 years is visible itself. The corporates have been going out, people have been going out to the international markets, etc. And I think multiple options exist as far as the private sector is concerned today.
Mr. Jaitley, if I could just ask you a final question to do something with politics. We've got a state, Gujarat, going into elections. BJP has been in power since the mid-90s. You have redefined how to fight anti-incumbency. The polls are also something that you must be taking light from.
Well, I think we are very confident of winning both Gujarat and Himachal Pradesh. We've governed very well in Gujarat, and the affluence which the BJP government has brought to Gujarat, the improvement in the quality of life, the infrastructure improvement, the industrialization of the state, the kind of impetus which has been given to that state is globally visible to all. And I'm sure Gujarat voters will be very kind to the BJP. As far as Himachal is concerned, it's a state which has been impacted by the worst form of corruption that we have seen in recent history. People are just waiting to get rid of that Congress government.
And your predecessor, P. Chidambaram, has applauded the government in Jammu and Kashmir from going from a no stakeholder conversation to an all stakeholder.
I think he should have been fairer to the government. We've gone from a no policy under UPA to a defined policy. Now let me remind you, during the UPA, they went and first announced 5 working groups of all political parties. I was a member of one working group. The group never met, but a report came out in the name of a group with regard to certain measures to be taken with regard to the center-state relationship and so on. We never got to see the chairperson of the group. I don't think he even knew what the report was because he was critically ill. So it was a farcical document that came out. Then Parliament was repeatedly told that there is a silent dialogue on. That non-existent, non-visible dialogue was UPA's way of dealing with the situation. I went twice as a part of an all-party delegation during UPA, and there was civil disobedience on the roads. Stone throwing as a phenomenon started then. There was no policy at all. Finally, when we took over, it took us a year or two to take control because there was stone throwing, there was civil disobedience, there was terrorism. We've put a block on terrorist funding. The Hurriyat leadership stands exposed in the eyes of the Kashmiri people itself. They stand alienated. Those mobs and crowds of thousands of stone throwers have all disappeared. Today you don't see that kind of disobedience. For the first time in the history of Kashmir in the last 25 years, the terrorists are on the run and the security forces are right on top. So we have appointed an interlocutor for a dialogue and appointed him at a time of our choosing. And therefore, to be fair, from a no policy during UPA, we have gone over to a structured policy where the Indian state as such and Indian institutions as such are in a position now to say, these are our people, we are willing to talk with all stakeholders, which effectively means that we are willing to speak to all our people and bring them onto the right track.
And do you think the opposition is running out of points to criticize the government on, and therefore is having to say things like gabbar state tax, like we've heard from Rahul?
Well, I'll tell you, I said this in Parliament, and I'm saying this again. How much does he know, and when will he know? Is he willing for a serious debate on some of these issues? The answer is no. Now, this has been one of the tax reforms in India which is being hailed all over the world. The GST Council has Congress ministers in it who are extremely positive and cooperative, who are a party to every decision which is unanimous. Thirdly, if there are compliance burdens on the small scale, we ourselves are conscious of it. After all, we are all a part of the different center and state elected governments. We are responding to that situation and therefore reducing that compliance burden as far as that segment is concerned. You are going to eventually present to the country one of the smoothest tax structures in the country, rather than those multiple 17 taxes and 23 cesses and a checkpoint every 20 kilometers, which the Congress has given us for all these years. And therefore, once we are trying to get rid of that system, I think he must have the broad shoulders in the Congress party to accept that these are changes. We have brought in India's economy today from a policy paralysis from which the world had turned its eyes away, from the most corrupt economy globally to the fastest growing global economy. That's the changes which are taking place, and I think Congress must have the magnanimity to accept
And on
that.
the eve of the 1-year anniversary of demonetization, they're continuing to call it a failure, saying you've not been able to find any black money in the system.
Well, I think if Congress thinks that there is no black money in the system, they have to search the houses of their own congressmen, and they'll know where it lies.
And with that, Mr. Jaitley, I'll thank you so much for talking to ET Now.